A great film always rewards repeated viewings. You begin to appreciate the minor details of the lighting and the production design, the movement of the actors, the placement of certain props in the background. Every subtle piece of dialogue and aspect of a particular scene enriches our experience of the story. That's the beauty of filmmaking. And it helps us to internalize the themes of the story in a powerful way. Esther works on that kind of level. There are so many layers to Esther that at first glance we might miss. Most of us know at least portions of this story. We know famous quotations from the book of Esther. And the first pass is that it's a simple story about a queen who ascends to the heights of power in order to save her people. And she shows great courage and bravery in the midst of that. But a closer examination reveals all the layers of Old Testament narrative that are woven into this story. The elements of satire, of reversal, of irony, of drama and tension in these incredible but flawed characters that are within the book of Esther. So the drama and the intrigue of Esther not only draws us into the story, but more importantly, it gets the story into us, that we might view our world in terms of God's sovereign working behind the scenes, hidden in ways that we often don't perceive in the moment, but perhaps in hindsight we see that he was always at work accomplishing his good ends. Esther chapter 1 to 2 sets the stage by introducing the three main characters, King Ahasuerus, otherwise known as Xerxes, Esther, and Mordecai, whose lives intertwine to bring about the dramatic deliverance of God's people in the midst of their affliction. This is Understanding Esther. In the last episode, we had a guest speaker, Brian Seagraves, who did a great job introducing the main themes of Esther, as well as giving some helpful background information. And I encourage you to listen to that first episode before this one to get a lay of the land. In this episode, we're going to look at Esther 1 to 2, which breaks down into three scenes. In chapter 1, we are introduced to King Ahasuerus, who seeks a queen to replace his wife, Queen Vashti. Second, we see Esther ascend to the throne in Esther 2, 1 through 18. And finally, Mordecai uncovers an evil plot against the king in Esther 2, 19 to 23. I'm not going to read the entirety of these chapters. I'm just going to summarize the ideas and summarize the major plot points, but I encourage you to carefully read through these as you listen to this and as you study this on your own. So let's look at that first plot point, where Ahasuerus seeks a new queen. The story begins by introducing King Ahasuerus of Persia, also known again as Xerxes I, who rules over a vast empire stretching from India to Ethiopia. And he hosts this extravagant 180-day display of wealth, followed by a 7-day feast in his palace at Susa, while Queen Vashti, his wife, holds a separate banquet for the women. Now, on the final day of his royal feast, slightly tipsy Ahasuerus commands 7 of his eunuchs to summon Queen Vashti and to crown her with a royal crown and then display her in front of a whole host of nobles and princes and military commanders. And he wants to display her beauty. Now, Vashti refuses, which angers the king and prompts him to consult his royal advisors, men who are aware of Persian law and custom. And one of his advisors, Memucan, warns that Vashti's defiance is going to inspire women across the empire to despise their own husbands, which is going to destabilize the peace of the empire with widespread contempt and disorder. So he advises the king not only to publicly banish Vashti and replace her with a more worthy queen, but also to issue a royal edict, a decree throughout the empire that every man is a master of his household. And Ahasuerus likes that idea, and so he issues the decree and sends letters in every language across his vast kingdom. A couple things to note about this. Esther, unlike the book of Ruth, takes place in the halls of power. Ruth is in the humble rural countryside, in the most unassuming of places, but Esther is much more in your face. This is a volatile, powerful king, And Esther is entering right into the center of that vortex of power. Ruth presents its main characters as exemplars of virtue. But Esther's cast is a little bit more of a mixed bag in terms of motives and morals and righteous decisions. In a sense, Ruth is like the Hallmark Channel, and Esther is a little more like HBO. And that shift is important for us as we approach this. But there are many parallels too. You have a female figure at the center, devoted to an older figure who takes them under their wing. So you have the Ruth-Naomi connection. Then you have the Esther-Mordecai connection. And marriage is a key part of the final deliverance of the story. We also see the familiar theme of God's hidden sovereignty. God is working all things behind the scenes to accomplish his good purposes. It's interesting that Esther, her name, is very close to the Hebrew verb satar, which means to hide or to conceal. And that's a big part of her story. She's concealing her Jewish identity. But on a larger level, God conceals his working in the background. He's not explicitly mentioned in his book in the way that he's not explicitly mentioned in Ruth. And yet his fingerprints are all over this narrative. So that's something to pay attention to. Let's think about this first scene, though. We notice that the author describes with painstaking detail the opulence and extravagance of the royal court, the over-the-top wealth. I mean, it's just beyond your wildest dreams, and it's full of decadence too. I mean, basically the king says, everyone drink as much as you want, all bets are off tonight. And this attention to detail, I mean, why doesn't just say that Ahasuerus was king, he held a party, 2 sentences long, move on with the story? Well, the author is trying to draw a picture of satire. He's trying to expose the folly of this center of power. And it's actually kind of a disturbing, dark vision. You know, this king who is a complete slave to his lusts and passions, and he's surrounded by these foolish advisors. He's the one with the keys to the kingdom. It's his moral discernment that's going to issue irrevocable decrees that affect the nation. So this is a dangerous world, especially for the Jews who are living as this religious minority within this vast empire. Persia conquered Babylon, and Babylon was already this confederation of smaller groups of people. And so these massive empires are very hard to manage and very hard to keep unified. And so there's this volatility at the heart of this story. And this sets up the main tension in Esther. How will God's people survive as exiles in such a dangerous and dark world? This volatile world that they find themselves in. Well, enter Queen Vashti, who refuses to parade herself as an object before the lustful eyes of her husband and his nobles. And her rejection sends shockwaves throughout the empire. It sends the king and his advisors into this emotional, irrational tailspin, because they're afraid this is going to embolden all the women of Persia to rebel against their husbands. Now, there's an irony in this situation that they publicly banish Vashti, and then they tell everybody that men are masters of their home. It's almost like they're propagating the very story they don't want to get out. It's not a very well thought out plan. And you can see the very fragile ego of Ahasuerus, and that fragile ego is going to reappear in Haman, the other main adversary in this story. But you can see, again, the volatility combined with this massive power, all concentrated in this one man, really raise the stakes of the story. And yet, it is precisely through the irrational, prideful actions of this king and his advisors that Esther is able to ascend to the throne. So Vashti's banishment is actually setting the stage for the elevation of Esther. Now, there's one particular detail that some commentators zero in on that I think is very perceptive. It's this focus on King Ahasuerus' request for Vashti to wear her crown, her royal crown. I don't think that Ahasuerus is merely a slave to his lust, though that's certainly true. I think there's something political going on here. He rules over 127 provinces, it's a political nightmare. He's having to deal with all these different people groups, cultures, languages, and different governors and rulers who have their own influence and power. And he's trying to unify them. And he's trying to show his dominance and his supremacy. Keep all those lesser princes, governors, and military generals in check. And so having Queen Vashti come in with her royal crown is his way of not only demonstrating his power, right? But it's also making her a representative of Persia's glory. She is Miss Persia. And her glory and her beauty is meant to draw these other nations under his power, these other people under his power, into unity to say, we want to be a part of that. And not only that, but it's showing that the Persian Empire is the apex, and he is the king of that apex nation. And so it's a display of his power, of his glory, and it's meant to create political stability, which then explains why he's so flustered and angry when she rejects him. It's not just a personal slight, but it threatens the stability of his kingdom. It's really saying, you actually aren't the king. You actually aren't that powerful. It's a public shaming that is very detrimental to his rule. So that political aspect is very important as well. Vashti becomes this living symbol of unity, kind of like our Statue of Liberty, right? This symbol that brings this collective sense of identity. And her refusal is very problematic. Her banishment, again, sets up the next scene where the king says, well, I want a more worthy queen. I want a better representative of the glory of Persia, and by extension, my own royal glory. That leads to the next scene in Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 18, in which Esther ascends to the throne. The king sends his men to gather a host of beautiful young virgins from across the empire to his royal harem in Susa. And the women receive extensive beauty treatments in order to present themselves as pleasing to the king for a shot at becoming queen. And among them is Esther, who's a Jewish orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai, who instructs her to conceal her Jewish identity. Very important detail there. Now, there's a difference between lying about your identity and concealing it and not offering the information. And there's debate about whether she was right in doing this or not. But there's something interesting here where, why does Mordecai want her to hide her identity? Because at this point in the story, there's no threat to the Jews. That comes later with Haman's plot. And surely the Jews feel vulnerable when they're in exile. They're not sure what the future holds for them. But it seems like if Persia was hostile toward Jews by nature, there would have been no opportunity for Mordecai to ascend to the heights that he did, or why would he even consider Mordecai at all? And even when her identity is revealed, you don't see any hatred from Ahasuerus. He seems kind of ambivalent. And so her hiding of her identity is this interesting wrinkle. It may be that Mordecai is also politically maneuvering. He recognizes that a genealogy-less woman, a woman with no background, may actually serve as a better representative of Persia. She's this universal figure. And so all the nations can see themselves in her. She's a commoner. She's from the people. And perhaps that's what makes her more appealing. And maybe Mordecai knows that. And it's interesting that when Esther gets her chance to meet Ahasuerus, it doesn't seem like he really presses her on her ethnicity. It's not even clear that he would have cared very much at all. But there's something appealing about her lack of identity that allows her to be this easily manipulated vessel for King Ahasuerus. It's a speculation, but I think it might illuminate some other aspects of this story. Now, Esther is crowned queen because she finds favor with King Ahasuerus. She gains favor with Haggai, the eunuch in charge, and receives good provisions and placement. There's a humility. She's not asking for anything extravagant. And the ability to gain favor is repeatedly referenced. She's able to ascend because she is able to, through her grace and her beauty and her elegance, win and the affection of those in power, and that brings her upwards. So the king crowns her queen and celebrates with a great feast and grants gifts and tax relief throughout the provinces. Now, immediately there are some moral questions. Again, we talked about whether it was right for her to conceal her identity, but there's a more pressing one of why is she even going to the harem in the first place. You have to remember, women at the time don't have a lot of rights. They don't have a lot of agency in their life. And so it's hard to see how much control she had over this. And you also have to imagine that the prospect of marrying off a daughter into royalty secures provision and protection for your family, especially if you're a foreign minority like the Jews in Persia. Now, it does seem to suggest, with the language, at least the implication of physical intimacy between Esther and the king. Now, that's a tricky thing. And we have to remember that this is a morally mixed bag in terms of the cast of characters we find here. It's very different from Ruth. I do think we can sympathize, at least, that her complicity in this act seems lessened, considering her lack of agency. Maybe she didn't really have a choice. And the text does seem silent from any explicit moral judgment. It's not to say it's an unimportant point, but it's not the main point to focus on. And I think actually it raises important questions that readers and audiences ought to wrestle with. But all that being said, this is, again, presenting Esther in her beginning stages as somebody who's sort of swept up in the currents of life. She follows Mordecai, she follows Ahasuerus. She doesn't possess a lot of agency, but as the story progresses, that changes. And she begins to exercise her own authority and power in important and influential ways. The fact that she has two names, her Hebrew name Hadassah and then her Persian name Esther, really gives us insight into a little bit of her internal struggle, which again, in Esther, it's very plot-driven. Ruth is very dialogue-driven. You get more of an insight into their inner life, but with Esther, you have to read between the lines a little bit. But these two names represent the tension within her, where she's straddling the fence of two different worlds. This Persian world, this elite world, and her own world with her people, her familial life, her Jewish identity. And that tension comes at a head when she actually ascends the ranks of power. But again, this is setup. And in particular, this scene is a setup for the next scene, because Vashti must descend in order that Esther may ascend, so that Mordecai will eventually ascend. Because in this next scene, Mordecai, Esther's cousin and adoptive father, stumbles upon a plot by two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, at the king's gate to assassinate the king. And so now that he has a connection to Esther, and Esther has risen up in the ranks, he can report it to her, and she reports it to the king, and that puts Mordecai's name in the ring, so to speak. And the conspirators are executed, and the event is recorded in the royal chronicles in the king's presence, a very important detail. But right here, Mordecai's good deed, because of the events that come before it, gets woven into this larger narrative. It becomes the first stepping stone for him to eventually assume a place of power as well. And you can hear those faint echoes of Joseph's story and Moses' story and even hints of Daniel, where you have an Israelite in a foreign land rising up the ranks because of something they do for the king. What do we make of these opening chapters in terms of the larger scope? Well, God works through unlikely circumstances and broken, sinful, fallen people to bring about stunning reversals and quote-unquote coincidences that reveal his sovereign providence. Nothing happens by chance, but rather reality unfolds with this poetic fittingness. Oftentimes, actions and events intended by one character for a particular outcome produces the direct opposite effect. And this satire is to say that this king, who thinks he can control the world, who has all the power, wealth, and access that he wants, is actually a fool. And his deeds and actions are all under the sovereign hand of God. That he can't do anything against God's will. And that even his sinful actions, in a mysterious way, are grafted into the story of God. God draws straight lines with crooked sticks. And who among us lacks any crookedness? Yet even our imperfect attempts at faithfulness serve some role in God's unfolding purposes. There is a king above the Persian king. There is a will above the king's will. There is a law and an edict and an irrevocable promise that supersedes anything an earthly ruler or power can enact. And this ought to give us courage and hope in our own day. Because the same God who worked behind Esther, Mordecai, and even Ahasuerus works among us as we continue our sojourn in exile in this foreign world.